Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. Well, in this particular episode, I'm looking at the problem of the channel getting too big. And by that I mean just so many comments coming through that I physically don't have the time to respond to all of them as I normally would. Rest assured, however, I do still read them. And I thought that something that I've noticed with the comments that have been coming through is that a lot of times people don't necessarily read the comments that others have written before them and post their own comments. Now, this isn't a problem, except that I think that some of the comments that are posted have got some real value and have certainly changed the way that I approach GMing completely. For example, the whole online role-playing. I have become a convert as a result of all of the emphatic responses that were added below. So I've decided that once a month what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out some of the comments that have come through on the channel and discuss them, the good and the bad. This is not necessarily answering questions, it might be just reflecting on some particularly wise solutions to a problem presented in the video or some good old-fashioned camaraderie that's come up. So if I go to our very first video comment, and you must excuse my pronunciation. When we look at the video, when should you cheat? Now, this video has raised the ire of a lot of people, and a lot of people have understood the meaning behind it. So, what is this when should you cheat? What are some of the comments? Kyle Smith wrote, I have lost a good number of characters from bad rolls. Sometimes the GM retcons things. Other times I am rewarded with a character having an epic demise. Now, this speaks exactly to the reason why I would advocate that you should cheat during a game. In order for a GM to retcon, in other words, to undo something that's happened, or to go, oh, the dice have rolled, you should die, but it's a very flat death and it doesn't make sense, and there's all kinds of implications if you fail. I just don't like that. A god comes down and stops the whole thing, or someone casts something, or there's a little old NPC that no one saw and she comes running up and she heals you. That is a very, in my opinion, sloppy way of solving a problem that was induced because of the dice. Again, GM screens in the past were there to hide the dice rolls of the GM, specifically so that they could change the outcome. Now, by changing the outcome, I mean by changing the dice. Instead of rolling and going, well, you've taken 42 damage. Oh, does that kill your character? Look at that 42, and before you give out the answer, it's a case of saying, all right, you've got a lot of hit points left. No, you don't. All right, you take 8 hit points, 9 hit points. You change the value slightly so that the game can continue without this horrendous death, which is really meaningless. So I would say that in terms of this comment, trying to avoid retconning is one of the reasons why you should cheat. Lamia Domina responds, this entire attitude is outrageously toxic and a huge part of the reason these games have historically been so repulsive to anybody but an extreme niche audience. Lamia Domina, I think, raises a very valid point here. It creates a toxic environment if there is no sense of honesty, if there's no sense of purpose behind the GM cheating on those rolls. Now, a GM who just cheats all the time, or worse yet, a GM who cheats to win or to defeat players is not the right kind of GM. And Lamia, I would agree with you absolutely, totally on that point. I think also that you may have misinterpreted the amount of cheating that I advocate. Again, it's about making sure that the dice don't dictate something that is so horrendously dull, boring, or outright depressing that your game experience is ruined because of it. Now, I'm not saying cheat on every roll. Sometimes you've got to let the roll go through and just see where that leads you, because it can be really, really interesting. So yes, I don't advocate every single roll should be cheated, and I don't advocate that one should cheat for the sake of cheating. It always should have a very singular purpose. Paul the Skeptic wrote, "I see what you're saying. You don't have to be a machine. The story is the important part. I don't think your character should die unless it's part of the story. The DM should be able to come up with something. A nearby healer or being taken prisoner, something. Something it's not fun to die in the first 5 minutes of the game." Absolutely agree with you here. It isn't fun for the character to die in the first minutes of the game because they made a simple roll that caused the death of the character. On the other hand, there is a balance that must be found, and that balance is very, very simply up to the GM to decide. Is this fun? Is this making the game entertaining, or is it not? Are we following the rules? Are we being a simulationist? That word's been passed around a lot recently, and there's been some interesting discussions around should a game be simulationist or narrative-based or a mixture in between. I know I strongly advocate for narrative, but if you had to ask me, I would say that I sit somewhere in the middle. I like to use simulations to obviously make the game work and to create a sense of drama and tension, but at the same time, that story is more important than any simulation value out there. It's about balancing, though, how you present that to your players. Moving along, there's just 4 more comments on cheating. Now, cheating, of course, it seems to be a very sore issue with people, and so we've got to treat it very, very carefully. I've skipped one. Gabriella Grove says, "Balancing roles without the players noticing is extremely difficult for me. I am only trying after playing in both my players' games, as they are also GMs. It is known in our group that I tend to roll high, and they were hesitant to even let me GM because of this." Balancing cheating, fudging the rules, making a GM decision that overrides the dice, however you want to phrase it, is very difficult. And what is the guiding principle? What's that guiding line? I don't advocate that you just accept every roll that you're given. I don't advocate that you cheat on every roll that you're given. I simply say, look at that value before you declare it to the player or the player group and say, does this value make for interesting storytelling or not? Can I see the outcome of this or not? If the outcome is death of character or something that really doesn't fit with what you're trying to get out of the session, ignore it. If it does, keep it. In the case of high rolling, well, if you're a high roller, I'd go gambling. Pyromancer 2K says pretty much all the examples are examples of simply making a DM ruling on how something is going to go rather than what most consider fudging the dice. Fudging the dice is choosing to ignore a dice roll because you don't like the result. This is what most players are talking about as they say it lets your DM decide whether you live or die. But there is no dice roll. But if there is no dice roll, there is no fudging. It's simply an executive decision by the DM for something to happen which most players are usually fine with. And if it speeds things along and doesn't screw them over, like declaring the guy dies without fall damage roll, for example, then everything is fine. This is a great interpretation of the video. It is about making a decision, and whether you want to call it an executive decision, whether you want to call it cheating, whether you want to call it DM prerogative, whether you want to call it the GM has made a call, however you want to play it, you as the GM have to stick with that call though. Oh, we got some thunder outside. Maybe I've angered the bigger players out there. You have to stick to that call. You have to decide this is the call that I've made, regardless of what the dice are saying or with what the dice are saying, but you have to accept responsibility for that. And I think that's very important. So yes, absolutely. If you want to call it executive decision making, by all means go ahead and do that. If that allows you to be able to draw a better differentiator as to when to ignore the dice and when to use the dice, go for it. The Swamper writes, when should you fudge dice as a GM? Never, ever, ever. Don't roll if you are unwilling to accept the outcome. I have a bit of a challenge with this particular statement. It's a random dice generator, so you don't know what roll it's going to be. Now, to simply accept the role that, well, this happens and so the story grinds to a miserable halt whilst the characters slog through another combat that just takes 400 rounds because the players are rolling low numbers for their damage, the creatures are not hitting on their attacks, and everyone is just taking 400 years to slowly work through the whole situation. Roll your to-hit values on the creatures, make them hit themselves, make their hit points less, cheat on those dice to get that battle over with. Why run through the exact numbers if you have to? It just gets dull. So I have to disagree with you on that point. I think there is a time and place for cheating. Finally, Jeremiah Zemter says, never ever cheat on rolls. If you fake it, it's not a game anymore. Just a bullcrap storytime jerk around. Well, that's an interesting take on the whole situation. And if you don't have rolls, then you are just telling a story. But I think that you're missing the point. The roles can be used for drama to make that bullcrap storytime just that much more interesting. That's the whole idea in my world anyway, and in my opinion, as to how the game should be run. It should be an entertaining game where the dice add to the entertainment factor, not detract from it. And if they detract from it, why should you not have the capacity to be able to work around it, over it, or to simply overrule those numbers? So that's looking at that particular video. If we move on, here are some comments on the Are You a Dick GM? Again, this video seemed to garner a lot of interest from people and raise again the ire of some viewers and have massive support from others. Amagon writes, how do you deal with players that are not overly familiar with the rules when designing encounters? What I mean is, sometimes I design encounters that I think are completely doable, but then the players end up stuck because they don't understand the limitations or the difficulty of the situation created by the rules. Well, this is a very interesting space. It doesn't really address the Are You a Dick rule, except that it brings into play the are you applying all of your knowledge as a GM or a DM to create an environment that players who have no experience in are finding it difficult to interact with. And by the sounds of things, that's exactly what's happening. Because you have a solution and your players don't, doesn't mean that you should just let your players sit there and wonder what to do, or get bored, which would be even worse. It also doesn't mean that you should make them make endless rolls to see if they come up with a good idea. Force-feeding your players the solution to your situation by making them roll a history check, roll a survival check, roll a percentile chance check, roll a this, none of that's going to make for good storytelling. Your situation may simply be too complicated for them to understand or to grasp. The best solution here would be to have the environment change to ease up a little bit on the circumstances, if I'm reading your question correctly. Mod Sugar Cookie says, so I'm about to GM my first campaign. Good for you. I say it in quotations because it's less about a narrative and more about visiting different environments from a central hub. There's a loose narrative around how the characters met and why they're going to the hub in the first place, but I'm unsure if I should be running a more narrative-driven game for my first go. I have a beginning, an ending, and loose goals for each environment in order to progress to the next, but it feels like more of a game than a story. So, that's a very, very good question. It's a very good situation to be in, and I don't see how it flits under Are You a GM, a Dick GM, but that's why I love the comments. It's because when you're reading through things, suddenly questions like this pop up and you go, oh, that's a great question, or that's a great situation to unpack and explore in a situation like this. I have run a game myself with time traveling where the players were in a central hub and they were bouncing between different timelines and time stories, and each one seemed to be completely separate from the other. Each one contained its own self-contained story that they just happened to stumble into, aka the TV series Quantum Leap. So it is perfectly acceptable to do a moving around different planes, jumping from the hub to these different environments. Personally, I would advocate that you have some kind of overarching story. Why are they going to these different zones, and what does each zone do for them? And is there someone who's manipulating the zones that they're going to create a certain outcome that's favorable for them? These kind of bigger stories you can develop as your campaign progresses. You don't have to have it straight off the bat. Don't begin by trying to figure out everything. But after 3 or 4 adventures, there should be some NPCs that they've interacted with. There should be some NPCs that the characters have made enemies of. And there should be some NPCs that the characters have made allies of. All of it comes together to perhaps inspire you to say, well, if I look at those different circumstances, they could be linked together to create this very interesting space, this interesting story that seems to be taking place and unfolding as the story goes along. That would be my advice, but because it's your first campaign, jump straight in and start going, and let your players know that it's your first campaign if they don't already, and warn them that, well, hey, this is something that I'm learning, and hopefully you will be learning along with me and showing me the error of my ways. Then finally, Vladimir Guludov says, I strongly disagree about rules, Dick. If you are playing your game by the rules and they don't make your game better but worse, you are probably playing the game wrong. Probably it's just not fitting your style of play. Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. My channel is all about the story-driven role-playing. It is not a simulationist channel, and you won't find a video on here where I look at, dissect, advise, or speak about actual mechanics. Those are for the simulationists, and they have their place, absolutely. I would advocate that when rules do cause things to go wrong, that's when you need to look at them. Now, obviously you can't change it halfway through. A man riding a horse suddenly shouldn't start making a different type of skill check to ride that horse if at the beginning of your game you established that it was horse riding that needed to be rolled. So changing rules is very bad. You need to be consistent, whatever the outcome or whatever the rules decision might be. Rules can get in the way because what rules are applicable and what rules aren't applicable. Physics needs to be here. Yes, that's fantastic. This needs to be here. This needs to be here. But we don't have all of the rules to run a perfectly simulationist outcome, do we? We are ignoring a lot of different factors when we are playing this game. So it's about deciding which factors to ignore, which factors to use to your advantage, and which factors to drive to get your story into a better place. Well, at least that's my opinion on the matter. Let me know what you think about this idea of going through your comments and discussing them and breaking them down. Do you think they're helpful? Do you think they're useful? Do you gain some kind of value from this discussion? And if you do, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And hit that subscribe button if you want to see more videos from this channel. And there always will be. Don't worry about that. You can join me on Patreon. There's one-on-one coaching. There's Q&A sessions with me live every second Wednesday. And we generally have a lot of fun. So until next time, I wish you the very best and happiest of gaming.